The wind carried the scent of dry earth and pine needles across the lonely plains, whistling through the branches like a voice from another world. Night was falling, stretching shadows long across the land, and the silence was broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the low rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. In that quiet she walked, her steps unsteady, yet pulled forward by something she could not name. The land itself seemed to breathe around her, every sound sharper in the dark, every shadow holding secrets she was not certain she wanted to uncover. Yet her heart beat faster, not with fear alone, but with a kind of pull that felt older than the world she knew. She had never thought her path would cross with his. The Apache stood apart from anything she had ever known. His presence wrapped in both strength and mystery, his silence speaking louder than the words men around her often wasted. When she first saw him, there had been no greeting, no easy smile. Only his steady gaze that seemed to read something in her soul she had hidden even from herself. It was not the look of a man passing through. It was the look of someone who had already seen too much of life's hardness, yet carried it with a quiet fire that could not be smothered. Her life before that night had been one of routine and small cruelties, each day folding into the next, with little promise of change. She had learned to keep her voice low, her steps careful, her spirit tucked away where no one could bruise it. But the loneliness grew heavier with each passing season. She longed for something beyond the horizon, something that would remind her she was more than what others had decided she should be. The land was wide, endless, filled with whispers of freedom, but she had no guide, no reason to leave until the moment their paths crossed. The Apache came like a shadow out of the trees, tall and silent, his movements fluid as if he belonged more to the night than to the day. She should have been afraid, and perhaps she was, but her fear was tangled with something else, something that drew her closer instead of pushing her away. He did not ask for her trust, yet he carried himself as if he expected it, as if trust was not given but understood. Die. His presence reminded her of the old stories people whispered by firelight, about warriors who moved with the spirit of the earth, who fought for what was theirs and carried the weight of their people on their shoulders. There had been no words at first, only silence stretching between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Yet when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost like a murmur carried by the wind. Near you, I lose myself. The words struck her with a force she could not explain. They were not the words of a man playing at charm, not the words of someone trying to bind her with sweet promises. They felt raw, honest, the kind of truth that cut deeper than polished speech. And in that moment, something in her shifted. The night grew darker as he turned away, walking with steps that were steady and sure, as if the land itself bent to guide him. Without thinking, she followed. Every fiber of her body told her she was stepping into the unknown, but the pull was too strong to resist. Her mind filled with questions. Where was he taking her? What waited in the shadows? What would happen if she kept walking but her feet carried her forward, guided by the quiet rhythm of his stride? The land seemed alive as they moved together. The moon hung heavy in the sky, silver light spilling across the ground, turning the grass and stones into something almost unreal. She could hear the steady sound of his breathing, the soft crunch of his steps, and beneath it all, the pounding of her own heart. The world she had known, with all its limits and familiar cruelties, felt farther away with each step. The night wrapped around them like a cloak, hiding them from everything except the path ahead. She tried to speak once, to ask where they were going, but the words caught in her throat. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself, that made her silence feel necessary, as if speaking too much might break whatever fragile thread held them together in that moment. Instead, she let the quiet stretch on, her thoughts racing faster than her steps. The darkness deepened as they left the last faint traces of the settlement behind. Out here, the stars burned brighter, the air sharper, filled with the scent of pine and dust. The Apache paused only once, turning his head just enough for her to catch the glint of moonlight in his eyes. It was not a question, not even a command, but a silent acknowledgement that she had chosen to follow. Her breath caught, her chest tightening with the weight of what she had done. She could still turn back. She could return to the safety of what she knew, to the small, dim world she had always inhabited. But she did not move. Instead, she took another step forward. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, roots and rocks catching at her skirts, yet she pressed on. The Apache did not slow, but neither did he leave her behind. His pace was steady, almost measured, as if he knew the land so well that he could walk it blind. She wondered how long he had lived in these woods, how many nights he had walked this same path, how much of the earth's memory was written into his bones. He carried himself like a man who had seen war, who had felt loss, who knew the cost of survival. And yet there was something else in him too, something she could not quite name. The silence between them grew heavier the deeper they went. She wanted to ask him why he had spoken those words to her, why he had chosen her out of anyone he could have passed on the trail. She wanted to know what he saw in her that made him turn, what he expected her to find at the end of this journey. But the night held its own kind of command, and her questions stayed locked inside. The forest thickened, branches weaving overhead, cutting off much of the moonlight. The air grew cooler, the sounds sharper, every snap of a twig echoing louder in the dark. Her pulse quickened, her mind whispering warnings she could not silence. When yet beneath the fear, there was an undercurrent of something else, a strange sense of belonging she had never felt before. It was as if the land itself was testing her, asking if she was strong enough to keep walking. When they reached a clearing, the Apache finally stopped. He stood at the edge, tall and silent, his figure outlined by the faint glow of starlight. For a moment he said nothing, only stared out into the distance as if the night itself was speaking to him. She stood a few steps behind, her breath shallow, her hands trembling with both anticipation and fear. Then he turned, his gaze locking on hers with a quiet intensity that rooted her to the spot. The silence between them stretched, heavy and charged, until finally he spoke again, his voice steady, but carrying something unspoken beneath it. The night will test you. Beyond this place, there is no turning back. Her heart raced, her body frozen between the safety of retreat and the pull of stepping forward. She did not know what lay beyond that clearing, what dangers or revelations waited in the shadows. All she knew was that she had followed him this far, and the choice before her was no longer simple. The night around them held its breath, waiting. And so did she, caught in the space between fear and longing, between the world she knew and the one she could not yet see. The clearing seemed almost sacred under the watchful sky, as if the stars themselves guarded its edges. The Apache stood tall, his silhouette sharp against the faint glow of night, while she lingered at the edge, torn between fear and the strange pull that had carried her this far. His words still echoed inside her chest, heavy with meaning she could not untangle. Beyond this place there is no turning back. She felt the weight of it, the kind of warning that wasn't meant to scare her, but to remind her of a truth she hadn't yet grasped. The silence between them stretched until even the sound of her own breathing seemed too loud. She thought of the life she had left behind only hours before. The walls that had confined her, the narrow streets of the small settlement where gossip traveled faster than the wind, the eyes that always watched her with judgment or pity. She had walked those paths day after day, never really living, only surviving. Her heart had longed for something beyond the reach of familiarity, but she had never dared to chase it. And now here she was, under a wide sky, following a man she barely knew, into the dark. It felt reckless, dangerous, even foolish. Yet every part of her told her this was where she was meant to be. The Apache turned slowly, his dark eyes catching the faint shimmer of starlight as he looked at her. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His presence alone carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. When he finally moved, it was with the same grace that had unsettled her from the beginning, a grace that seemed carved into him by the land itself. He gestured for her to follow, and she did, her steps small but determined. As they walked, the forest whispered around them. Branches creaked as though sharing secrets, and the rustle of unseen creatures reminded her how alive the night truly was. The deeper they went, the more she realized how little she understood about the world he lived in. Every tree seemed to hold a story, every shadow a memory. He belonged here in a way she never had anywhere. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, almost blending with the wind. "You left something behind." The words pierced her. She wanted to deny it, to shake her head, but the truth pressed too close. She had left behind not only a life she despised, but also pieces of herself she was not sure she would ever reclaim. She thought of the people she had known, the harsh voices, the cold stares, the endless feeling of being small and unseen. Maybe she had left those burdens, but part of her wondered if they would follow, no matter how far she walked. "What if it finds me again?" she asked, her voice trembling though she tried to steady it. He glanced at her briefly, then turned back to the path. "Only if you carry it with you." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than anything else. She didn't know if she could truly leave behind the weight of all that had shaped her. But his words planted something inside her, a seed of possibility she had never allowed herself to imagine. The night grew colder, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She wanted to ask him why he had chosen her, why he had spoken those words "near you. I lose myself," but the questions felt too heavy for the moment. Instead, she studied him as they walked. His shoulders bore the mark of labor and battle, his posture straight yet unyielding. He was not a man who spoke without meaning. Whatever path he was leading her down, it was not one he had chosen lightly. They came to a riverbank, the moonlight glistening across the water like shards of glass. He stopped there, crouching low, and dipped his hand into the current. For a moment he stayed silent, his fingers breaking the surface of the water as though drawing strength from it. She stood behind him, unsure of whether to speak, until he finally rose to his full height again. "This land remembers," he said softly. "Every river, every stone, it does not forget." The words made her shiver, though not from the cold. She thought of how her own life had been marked by moments she wished could vanish, yet they clung to her as stubbornly as scars. Maybe the land and she were not so different. "Does it forgive?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned to her then, and for the first time she caught something in his eyes that softened the edges of his strength. Pain, perhaps, or a memory that still weighed on him. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice carried the heaviness of someone who had lived too much. "Forgiveness is not in the land, it is in the living." The words settled deep inside her, as if he had handed her a truth she was not yet ready to carry. The silence that followed was thick, filled with things neither of them knew how to say. She realized then that his mystery was not just in the way he moved or spoke, but in the history he carried, a history carved into his very being. She wondered what battles he had fought, what losses had etched themselves into his soul, what love or grief had taught him to speak in riddles that felt more like truths. As the night wore on, her legs ached from walking, but she didn't complain. The path was rough, the forest dense, yet she kept following him. Something inside her whispered that this journey was not just about the distance they covered, but about the transformation each step demanded. She could feel herself changing, shedding layers of fear and hesitation she had clung to for so long. They stopped again near a cluster of rocks where the forest opened into another clearing. The Apache scanned the area, his eyes sharp, his body tense, as though he expected danger hidden in the shadows. She stood behind him, uncertain, but trusting the steadiness of his presence. The night was no longer just beautiful. It carried a weight she couldn't explain. Every sound felt magnified, every movement in the dark a possible threat. "Why did you bring me here?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He did not answer right away, and when he did, his words were measured, almost careful. "Guess you are not meant to remain where you were. Something in you is waiting, and it will not wait forever." Her breath caught. His words echoed her own secret thoughts, the ones she had buried too deeply to ever voice aloud. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but his gaze silenced. There was something in his eyes that told her this was not about simple explanations. Whatever lay ahead would reveal itself in time, and pressing too hard would only scatter the meaning. The night deepened around them, the forest alive with unseen movement. She felt the weight of his warning earlier, that beyond this place, there was no turning back. Though her heart was heavy with uncertainty, she knew he was right. She had stepped too far into this path to retreat now. The woman she had been before could not walk back into her old life. Not after hearing his words. Not after feeling the pull of something greater waiting in the dark. She stood in the clearing, her breath mingling with the cool night air, the silence pressing around them like a secret on the verge of being spoken. The Apache remained steady, his presence as unyielding as the stones beneath their feet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, the sound carrying across the trees like a warning. Her pulse quickened. Whatever journey she had stepped into was only just beginning, and the weight of the unknown pressed closer with every heartbeat. The forest, the river, the stars, all seemed to conspire in silence, holding back the answer to the question that burned in her chest. What awaited her beyond this night, she did not know. But she could feel it, looming just out of reach, as if the darkness itself was preparing to reveal its truth. The air in the clearing hung heavy, carrying a stillness that made every sound sharp and urgent. The woman stood uncertain, her breath shallow, the stars above spinning their slow circle, as if they too were watching. The Apache's words had struck something deep in her, yet she had no clear grasp of what they meant. All she knew was that she was caught between two worlds, the one she had left behind, and the one stretching before her in the darkness, unknown and unyielding. He moved with quiet precision, his gaze sweeping the trees as though searching for signs invisible to her. His silence pressed against her like a weight, making her wonder if he regretted letting her follow. She opened her mouth to ask, to demand clarity, but the sharp flick of his hand stilled her. His body had grown tense, shoulders squared, eyes narrowing. She froze where she stood, the sound of her heartbeat louder than the night itself. From somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch cracked. It was small, faint, but not lost on him. Reached for the knife at his belt, his movements swift and certain, every part of him shifting from guide to protector. She followed his eyes into the dark, but the shadows revealed nothing. The fear that had hovered on the edges of her mind now pushed close, urging her to turn back, to run, yet her feet refused to move. When the silence returned, the Apache lowered his hand slowly, though the tension in his body did not ease. "Others are near," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble against the hum of night. "Not friends." The warning cut through her like a blade. She wanted to ask who they were, what danger waited in the dark, but the way he said it told her enough. Whoever moved out there carried threat, and if not for his watchful eyes, she might have stumbled right into it. For the first time, she felt the true weight of leaving her old life. Safety had not followed her here. Whatever this new path was, it carried danger just as much as promise. He led her away from the clearing, their steps careful, almost soundless. Her heart pounded as they weaved deeper into the forest, every rustle behind them feeding the thought that unseen eyes were following. Yet she did not speak. She kept her silence as he had taught her with his gestures, and with each step, she felt herself shedding more of the woman she once was. Fear was still there, but it was different now. Sharper, a tool rather than a chain. When they reached higher ground, he stopped again, scanning the valley below. The faint glow of firelight flickered in the distance, and her stomach twisted with unease. Whoever was camped there had brought the danger he had sensed. She could see his jaw tighten, the faint flare of his nostrils as he studied the light. His silence told her he knew them, or at least what they stood for, and that knowledge unsettled him. "What do they want?" she whispered. He did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire below, his body still as stone. Finally, he spoke, his tone clipped but steady. "They hunt what does not belong to them. Tonight they search." She felt the cold of his words settle deep into her bones. If they were searching, it could mean many things: land, food, people. Her chest tightened at the thought. She wondered if they would be the hunted before this night ended. As they watched, the wind shifted, carrying voices faint but clear enough for her to hear the roughness in their tone. Men spoke with the certainty of those who thought themselves untouchable, their laughter jagged, without warmth. She caught fragments of their words, none of them kind. The Apache's hand hovered near his weapon, yet he did not move. She realized then that every decision he made was weighed against not only his own safety but hers. His silence was not hesitation, it was strategy. They stayed on the ridge until the fire below burned lower, and the voices faded into a restless quiet. Only then did he turn to her, his eyes hard but calm. "We moved before dawn. They cannot see us first." Sleep never came easy after that. She sat against a rock while he kept watch, the darkness pressing close, her mind racing. She thought of the settlement she had left, the harshness of her old life, and wondered if those same men had ever walked those streets. The world she had known was small, but danger had always lurked at its edges. Perhaps it had followed her now, waiting for the moment she let her guard slip. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, her body ached with fatigue, but the urgency in his voice drove her forward. They traveled fast, his pace unrelenting. Her feet stumbled over roots and stones, yet she refused to complain. Every glance he gave her carried a quiet measure of respect, as if each step she managed proved something unspoken. As the sun rose higher, the forest gave way to open land, rolling hills stretching wide beneath the pale sky. It was beautiful in its own wild way, but it offered little cover. The Apache slowed, his eyes scanning the horizon with the caution of a man who had lived too many ambushes. He led her toward a line of cliffs, their edges jagged and steep, offering shelter in the caves that dotted their base. Inside one of those caves, they rested. The air was cool, damp, and the echo of dripping water filled the silence. She sat against the stone, drawing her knees close, while he moved with restless energy. Pacing, listening, his senses tuned to threats she could not detect. In the stillness, she studied him, her mind circling back to the words he had spoken when they first met. "Near you, I lose myself." They had felt strange at the time, almost impossible. Yet now, watching the weight he carried, she wondered if he had meant something deeper, that being near her pulled him into choices he would not make otherwise. The thought unsettled her. She was no warrior, no fighter. She carried nothing but her own fragile strength and the will that had driven her to follow him. Could she truly matter to someone like him, whose life was measured by survival and battles she could not imagine? The day wore on in silence, the sun shifting shadows across the cave walls. Once, she asked him what had brought him to these lands, but his only answer was a look that told her the question pressed against wounds too deep to open. She did not ask again. Instead, she let the silence speak for them, her thoughts turning to the men who still lingered somewhere beyond the horizon. When night fell again, the danger grew heavier. Fires glowed in the distance once more, and the wind carried the faint sound of horses. Whoever they were, they had not left. The Apache's jaw tightened as he studied the glow, his body rigid with focus. She felt the tension coil tighter between them, a storm building, but not yet breaking. In that moment, she realized the conflict was not just with those men out there. It was within her, too. She was torn between the fear that still clung to her old life and the fire that urged her to keep walking this new path, no matter how uncertain. And it was within him, though he hid it well. The weight of his silence, the guarded way he spoke, the shadow in his eyes had all told her he was wrestling with battles older than this night, battles she had yet to understand. The cave grew darker, the night pressing close again. She lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as he kept watch. The sound should have comforted her, yet her heart raced, knowing danger lay just beyond the reach of the firelight. She could not see the enemy, but she felt them circling like wolves, patient and hungry. Her mind filled with questions that clawed for answers. Why had he chosen to let her follow? What past bound him to this land and to the dangers that hunted it? And most of all, what would happen when those unseen men finally found their path? The night held no answers. Only the waiting, the silence, and the growing weight of the unknown. The storm was coming. She could feel it. And when it broke, nothing about their journey would remain the same. The cave was cold and damp, its walls pressing close, yet the air outside carried a sharper danger. She could feel it in the way the Apache moved, his body tense, his eyes never resting. The glow of distant fires burned low on the horizon, but their presence carried weight enough to shake the silence between them. Sleep would not come. She sat against the stone, clutching her shawl, listening to the slow drip of water and the occasional shift of his feet. Every sound was magnified by the darkness, and each one seemed like a warning of what lingered just beyond reach. He crouched near the mouth of the cave, his profile outlined by the faint light of the moon. There was a stillness to him, but not peace, more like a coil wound tight, ready to spring. She wanted to ask what he saw, what he heard, but she feared breaking his focus. His silence was its own kind of shield, and she clung to it. Yet her own thoughts betrayed her. If those men had followed them this far, what chance did they truly have? When dawn crept over the land, painting the cliffs in pale gold, the Apache rose without a word. His expression was grave, his movements swift. He motioned for her to stand, and together they left the safety of the cave, moving back into the cover of the forest. Every step was measured, every sound behind them sharper than it should have been. She sensed it too, the weight of pursuit. Somewhere out there, those men had not given up. The forest swallowed them, branches arching overhead, roots catching at her feet. She stumbled more than once, but he was always near, his hand steady when she faltered. The silence between them was heavier than any words could carry. It spoke of danger closing in, of time slipping through their hands. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine. The land opened into a winding path, flanked by steep walls of stone. He stopped at the edge, his eyes scanning the rocks above. She followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. It felt too still, too exposed, as though stepping forward would be stepping into the jaws of a trap. He seemed to feel it too. His hand hovered near his weapon, and his eyes narrowed. "Stay close," he said at last, his voice low, each word heavy with warning. Her pulse quickened as they moved into the ravine. The silence pressed harder, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching against gravel. She kept her eyes on the shadows, half expecting movement above them. The walls seemed to close in the farther they walked, the path narrowing, the air thick with unease. Halfway through, the sound came, a stone skittering down the slope, small but sharp enough to break the silence. She froze, her body tense. He stopped too, his hand rising in a quick signal for her to stay still. His eyes swept the ridges above, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then another sound, the faint creak of leather, the unmistakable click of metal. She gasped softly, her fear rushing to the surface, but he reached back, steadying her with a touch that spoke more than words. Danger was close, but he would not let panic rule them. They moved again, slower now, every step deliberate. She could feel the tension coil tighter with each breath. The ravine ended at last, opening into a stretch of forest where the shadows were deeper. Relief was short-lived. From behind them, faint but undeniable, came the sound of voices. Her heart leaped into her throat. They were being followed. The Apache quickened his pace, guiding her deeper into the trees. He did not speak, but his movements were sharper, his gaze darting from shadow to shadow. The voices grew louder, though still distant, carried by the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. These were men closing in, certain of their prey. They reached a stream, its waters rushing swift and clear. He paused only long enough to study the banks, then led her into the water. The cold bit at her skin, but she understood. Their trail would vanish here. They followed the stream until the trees thickened once more, the current masking the sound of their steps. Still, the unease clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. As night fell, they stopped on higher ground, where the forest thinned and the horizon stretched wide. The fires burned again in the distance, closer now, too close. She could see his jaw tighten, the weight of choice heavy in his silence. He was a man accustomed to danger, but she could see it in his eyes. This was no ordinary threat. Whoever those men were, they would not stop. Her thoughts turned restless. Was she the reason they hunted? Had her decision to follow him brought danger he would not have faced alone? The guilt pressed heavy, but she forced herself to stay silent. Whatever truth lay in their pursuit, turning back was no longer possible. She was part of this path now, for better or worse. When darkness swallowed the land again, they did not light a fire. They sat in silence, the cold pressing close, the forest alive with distant cries. He kept watch, his knife gleaming faintly in the moonlight, his body still yet ready. She could not sleep. Each rustle in the dark sent her heart racing, each sound of the wind a reminder of how close danger lingered. At one point, she whispered, "Why do they follow us?" His eyes stayed fixed on the shadows. When he answered, his voice carried a weight she had not heard before. "'Cause they take what they cannot earn. Land, lives, and now, us." Her breath caught. The word us rang inside her chest. She wanted to ask what he meant, if she was truly part of this fight now, but his silence told her the answer. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer an outsider. The night stretched on, each hour slower than the last. Her body ached with exhaustion, yet her mind refused rest. She thought of the life she had left, the safety she once believed was real. That world felt farther away than ever. Here, under the shadow of pursuit, she was learning a truth she had never known, that survival meant more than breath, that freedom came with a price. Before dawn, he moved again, guiding her deeper into the hills. The fires behind them had multiplied. The men were not only following, they were closing in. She could feel the storm building, the tension stretching thin like a cord ready to snap. Each step forward felt like a step toward something inevitable, something that would not be avoided much longer. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The view was wide, the horizon endless, but it offered no comfort. In the distance, dust rose from the earth, faint but unmistakable. Riders. Her breath quickened as she turned to him. His face was carved with focus, his jaw set, his eyes sharp. He did not speak, but she could feel the decision in him, heavy and certain. The time for running was ending. The men who hunted them were no longer shadows in the night. They were real, and they were closing fast. Her chest tightened as the truth pressed close. Whatever waited in the next hours would decide more than the path ahead. It would decide if this journey, this fragile bond formed in the dark, would endure or be broken by the weight of pursuit. The wind whipped across the ridge, carrying the sound of distant hooves. Her heart pounded as she realized the moment she had feared was no longer distant. It was coming, swift and certain. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The Apache stood tall, his figure outlined against the wide sky, his presence unshaken. She stood beside him, trembling yet unwilling to step back. The fires of pursuit were no longer distant glows. They were closing in, ready to strike. And as the dust rose higher, as the sound of riders thundered closer, she felt the world narrow to this single breathless point. The storm had come at last. There was no turning back. The night after the storm felt different. The air had cleared, leaving the valley washed and quiet, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath and was waiting to see what came next. She stood by the edge of the fire, her dress still damp in places, watching him as he moved with steady purpose. His hands, calloused from years of survival, worked over the bowstring, testing its strength. The crackle of flames and the soft howl of wind over the hills were the only sounds between them, yet the silence carried a weight all its own. The conflict they had faced was behind them, but the echoes of it still lingered in their bodies and minds. She thought of the journey that had carried her to this place. It's not just the physical miles across barren plains and shadowed forests, but the path through fear, doubt, and longing. The dangers they had faced seemed carved into her memory as clearly as scars on the skin. And yet, despite the battles, despite the long nights of uncertainty, there was something in his presence that gave her a sense of peace she had not known before. The Apache warrior had been a stranger, then a protector, then something deeper. She could not quite put words to it, but it was in the way he looked at her, as though he saw her not as a burden or an outsider, but as someone who belonged. The firelight caught the angles of his face, and she remembered his whisper that first night. "Near you I lose myself." At the time, it had stirred more questions than answers. Now, with all that had happened, those words carried a truth she understood. She had lost herself too, but in losing herself she had discovered something far greater. A bond forged not from ease or comfort, but through shared struggle, shared danger, and shared silence in the heart of the wilderness. The others who had doubted her choices were far away now, their judgments left behind like dust trailing off a wagon wheel. She thought of the lives they had escaped, the rules and chains that had bound her to a world where her voice was small and her worth overlooked. The land here was harsh, unforgiving, yet it had given her something more honest than she had ever known. It had forced her to find courage, to trust herself, and to trust him. As dawn painted the sky with pale streaks of gold and rose, he rose from where he had been crouching. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers across the fire. No words were needed. She stepped closer, the warmth of the flames at her back, the cool air brushing against her skin. When she reached him, he lifted her hand gently, as though it were something fragile, and placed it against his chest. She felt the beat of his heart beneath her palm, strong and steady, and she knew that whatever roads lay ahead, they would walk them side by side. The days that followed were quieter, though not without challenge. The wilderness did not soften simply because their bond had grown stronger. They hunted, they moved camp, they kept watch through the long nights when coyotes howled and shadows pressed close. But each trial carried less fear now. Even when uncertainty lingered, there was an unspoken faith that they would endure together. He taught her the ways of the land, how to read the sky for signs of weather, how to track by the smallest broken twig, how to listen to the silence as much as to the sound. She learned quickly, though she often laughed at her own mistakes, and he would smile in a way that seemed rare and precious, as if joy was a language he had not spoken in years. The conflict that had once loomed like a storm on the horizon became part of their story, but no longer the whole of it. She came to understand that every moment of fear, every narrow escape, had led them here. And though scars remained, they were not marks of weakness, but proof of survival. She carried them with pride, just as he carried his. One evening, when the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, they stood at the crest of a ridge overlooking the valley below. The river cut silver through the land, winding toward distant mountains where the last light touched the peaks with fire. She leaned against him, feeling the steady strength of his frame. He spoke then, his voice low and even. Life is not without sorrow. The land teaches us that. But the land also teaches that every night gives way to morning. She turned her face toward him, and in his words she heard not just wisdom, but promise. It was in that moment she realized the true heart of their journey. It was not about escaping what lay behind, nor only about surviving what lay ahead. It was about choosing every day to walk forward into the unknown, to meet both hardship and beauty together. "Near you I lose myself," he had said. But she understood now that it was not losing at all. It was a different kind of finding, one that could only be born in trust and in love, unspoken yet undeniable. Seasons would change. Rivers would rise and fall. The land would test them in ways they could not yet see. But as they turned away from the ridge and began the walk back toward the fire, she felt no fear of what was to come. The shadows stretched long, the night gathering once more, but his hand found hers, and that was enough. In the quiet rhythm of their steps, in the breath of the earth around them, there was an understanding deeper than words. The woman who had once felt small and lost had become someone different, shaped by the land, by trial, and by the bond that had formed in the wilderness. And the Apache, who had once carried only the weight of loss, carried now the strength of a shared life, a shared hope. The story did not end with the last conflict or the final whisper in the night. It lived on in every sunrise they faced together, in every fire they built to keep the dark at bay, in every choice to stand side by side no matter what waited beyond the horizon. And in that there was both an ending and a beginning. For in the end, the truest journey was not of escape or survival, but of two lives drawn together in the vastness of the old American frontier, where the wilderness was unforgiving yet honest, and where a whisper beneath the stars could change the course of everything.